This is going to be an art history tutorial that spans from 1841 all the way to the present day, focusing on Impressionism, Post-Impressionism and contemporary art. Impressionist art was founded on the basis that artists didn't want to make art that was really realistic. They wanted to reject the idea that that's all art could be, and they wanted to push art a little bit further. On the right, we have a picture of one of Claude Monet's water lily paintings, and on the left, we have a picture of Louis Leroy, who was a famous artist and art critic at the time. He, along with several other people in the 1800s, didn't like Impressionism. They didn't like what they were seeing. It was too different from what they had seen before. They didn't think that there was any skill in it, and Louis Leroy sort of came up with the title Impressionism by initially insulting their artwork by saying it's just an impression. There's not really any skill to what you're doing. But the artists were, in response to that, like, that's exactly what we don't want. We don't think it should be about representing something really realistically. It should be more of an impression. It should be more of a suggestion of what is there, trying to create an emotion for the viewer and trying to create a picture that the viewer could imagine themselves in. Impressionist artists focused on creating pictures that were based on the world that we live in, and most importantly, they focused on light and how to depict light, and that means how to capture it, how to draw it, how to paint it. So they focused on the colours that they were using, the types of brush strokes, the colour combinations, and water played a really important part in this movement, as light bounces off of water and it's really hard to capture that sort of imagery. So you'll see a lot of water lilies, a lot of ponds, a lot of lakes, a lot of rivers and things like that. After Impressionism, you have Post-Impressionism. Post means after, and so Post-Impressionism means artwork that came after Impressionism. The Impressionists were focused just on light and how to depict light in certain ways, and the Post-Impressionists thought that that was way too restrictive, and so they wanted to broaden the focus. They still looked at everyday subject matter, but they were looking at light, they were looking at movement, they were looking at line and more geometric shapes as well. So you may already, Post-Impressionists focused on line and how to use line to show movement. So you can see here that the sky is almost looks like it's moving, it's swirling, the stars are really bright and they're shining, so that's the use of portraying light, but it's not portraying light through different brushstrokes, it's more to do with line and more geometric shapes, and you can see those geometric shapes coming through at the bottom where you can start to see the village below and the different buildings. And also what's unique about Post-Impressionism is that they would all look at light and movement and colour and trying to create this impression of a place, but they didn't all restrict themselves to a certain style. So Impressionism work all sort of looks very similar, whereas there is a broad range of Post-Impressionist art. So within that you'd have different styles. So this is Seurat, and he used stippling, which is where you use a lot of dots, but he sort of created this style and he called it pointillism. He uses lots of different points, lots of little dots to build colour and tone, but also to build shape and form. And if you look at this really close up, it looks really abstract, but as you move away, you can start to see those shapes and people coming together. Then you've got contemporary art. So what does this mean? Contemporary means new, so contemporary artists work now. And contemporary art is a very broad range of styles. It's not restricted by just looking at light or colour or movement or just using paint. There's a lot of different styles and different subject matters that are looked at within contemporary art today. Artists can literally look at and use whatever materials they would like. So you could classify graffiti or installation, sculpture, drawing, painting. All of those broad ranges all still come under contemporary art. As long as they're made today, it's classed as, or from the 1950s onwards, that is classed as contemporary artwork. As I said, there's a lot of broad range of art, and it could be new art that they're making, or it could have a really specific influence from the past or previous art movement. So you might hear the term contemporary impressionism, and that is artists who are working today that are influenced by the impressionists and the post-impressionist artists. And one of the key people who is a contemporary impressionist is an artist called David Hockney. Now, he is one of the most influential, famous people of the contemporary art movement. He was born in 1937 and is really influential, but with his artwork you can see the influence that Impressionism, Post-Impressionism and Van Gogh specifically has had on his artwork. You can see the use of line, you can see the highlights on the haystacks and the use of light, and also Van Gogh painted haystacks, and so that subject matter is transferred across to his work. You can see the different lines and textures that he's got going on within his work. Also, the use of colour within his work is really creatively used. So he is an artist who is British but lives and works between the UK and California, and you can see the influences of those places in his artwork and in his colour palette specifically. So if you look at this image, this is an image of the Grand Canyon in America, and that is a very hot place, and so his images are a lot warmer and use more red tones and purple tones, whereas this is very obviously a British countryside, and so you've got cooler, more harmonious colours being used, whereas this is more seen from a British person's point of view as an exotic place, and you don't see natural formations like the Grand Canyon in the UK, and so this is portrayed as a very exotic place. You've got more contrasting colours being used to create a more vibrant image. His work is also on a very large scale, so you can see almost like a grid over this image, and that isn't a grid, it's just the lines where each canvas meets. So each of those small panels is a massive canvas. This piece is really, really big. One of his biggest pieces is 40 feet wide by 15 feet tall. As I said, he uses colour really creatively, and he also uses texture. He uses those both together to create depth and perspective in his work. So in this piece you can see that as things go further away from the viewer, they become smaller, but also they become lighter and cooler toned, and as they are closer to the viewer, they become bigger and more vibrant and more bold. And you can see also the use of layering and texture in his work. You can see that each field has a layer of green on it, and then built over the top of that is different lines, different textures to create different effects. Vincent van Gogh wasn't restricted by the Impressionists' focus on light. He wanted to broaden his focus on movement and texture and line and geometric shapes. And David Hockney is exactly the same. He doesn't want to be restricted by the Impressionist use of paint. iPads obviously are relatively new. They may be seen as taken for granted now, but for David Hockney, who was born in the 30s, that was a very new and exciting thing for him as an artist when they came out. And so he experimented with that medium to create images, and he created a range of iPad drawings, and some of which are on the screen now for you to see. And you can see how he has layered those images over the top, the different marks that you can use with, an iPad pen or your finger on a screen, and creating different kinds of brushstrokes and presets to create these images. Now, all of these artists that we've just looked at are quite different. Their visual styles, although have a similar thread, are quite visually different. But one thing that's really similar within their work is that, or their processes of how they made their work, is that they all painted en plein air. And en plein air means that they painted outside in plein air and painted what was in front of them. Now, this to us might not seem very unusual, but in 1841, just before the Impressionist movement started, tubed paint was invented. And again, another thing that may be taken for granted to us to have tubed paint or easily accessible and easily transferable paint to use. But prior to 1841, artists had to make their own work, make their own paint, and they had to mix pigment with oil in the right consistency to get that paint made, and then they had to put it into either glass syringes, which obviously could break and are very brittle, or they could use pigs' bladders. And that is obviously gross, first of all, but also they would be prone to exploding, and so that could be very messy as well. And also, to get the paint out of the pig's bladder, what they'd have to do is pierce a hole into it and squeeze out the amount of paint that they needed, but then there was no way to cover up that hole, and so the paint would leak out of it anyway. So tubed paint was a massive change, a welcome change to artists from 1841 onwards. Prior to 1841, artists still did paint outdoors, but they would do little sketches or little preparatory sketches or paintings and then take them back, and they would paint these larger scale pieces from their sketchbooks and the things that they've captured and drawn outside, and do it in their studio almost from memory. So here's a little overview of what we've just gone through. So 1841, tubed paint was invented. Artists were able to create full pieces en plein air. And then 1867, Impressionism started. Artists were starting to focus on light. 1886, Post-Impressionism started, and they started to broaden their focus and started to look at light and movement and line and geometric shapes. And then 1950 onwards, contemporary art happened, and about the 60s, David Hockney started to become really influential. One bonus fact to add into this is that photography was invented just before tubed paint became available, and photography was a real threat in the art world, as everybody thought that art was going to become redundant. They didn't think that it was going to have a use anymore, because art was seen as just making these really nice, beautiful pictures, or that it was also used to make family portraits because they didn't have cameras at the time. And so when photographs started to come in and become really popular, then art had to change. And so Impressionist artists were really key in making art survive